All right. Good morning, everyone. So today's talk is going to be on extreme heat and kind of its relation to human health. So obviously, all of us in Arizona see extreme heat. Wherever you go in the country, though, you're going to see extreme heat. So this is not just an Arizona thing. You're seeing, we're seeing this in Oregon, right? People are like, oh, it's cold in the Northwest, but they were hitting like 90s, and that's not normal for them, right? Places like Minnesota, Maine, everywhere in this country and even worldwide, we're seeing increased heat waves or high heat beyond what they're used to or ready for. So it's not just an Arizona component, but it's kind of nationwide. We'll focus on some of the issues here in Arizona today. So these are kind of our objectives. We're just gonna, this is not going to be a talk about heat exhaustion, heat cramps. That you guys should have already heard about in med school. So this I want to take to a different level and how heat is involved with other disease processes that we should be thinking about or understanding how climate change is affecting heat in different patient populations and why they may be vulnerable. And how some of these diseases may be magnified. Maybe it's compounded because they have one or two vulnerabilities plus maybe another disease process, and then that all of them make them even more risk for heat than just a normal person. We'll talk about heat and medications as well. I don't think we talk about that in terms of when you're learning your medications and this is what the side effects are. People usually don't talk about extreme heat and how that affects those medications. And then we're just talking about solutions, right? The goal with this is always to have solutions on board at some point. So when we talk Arizonification, right? We talk heat and pollution. Are those are probably our two biggest issues that we have in Arizona. So we have extreme heat for prolonged periods of time, but we also have really bad air quality. And these are both components that are coming from climate change, right? Climate change is driving this and increasing that temperature that we have in our desert. It's increasing the pollution, and they interrelate in some ways, right, air pollution is required. We're going to talk about this next week. You have to have high UV days, high temperatures, help create ground level ozone and some of the smog and pollution that we see in our cities. At the same time, so it kind of magnifies that way. At the same time, smog sometimes can reflect some of the heat that comes in from solar radiation. So it may decrease it a little bit. So sometimes on cloudy days, the heat is reflected by the clouds, and on smoggy days it's reflected. But if everything clears up, you could even have worse heat without air pollution. So it's kind of this weird interplay between air pollution and heat, but we see this kind of both are impacting our patients in two different ways. But they don't just cause the direct component of heat, right? It's not as like, oh my gosh, it's so hot, I can't go outside. There's side effects we kind of talked about yesterday. We alluded to things like people have trauma, maybe because they're an outside worker. They fall and break their leg because they were dizzy or dehydrated from that heat. We also see that heat and air pollution impact infectious disease, and we're going to talk about that, how vectors like mosquitoes and ticks have gone beyond their normal ranges because places are warming and allowing their range to basically expand. So there's an interconnection between a lot of these for both direct and indirect effects of heat. So we're going to talk a lot about, the heat-related illness. We may have alluded to this yesterday, but we don't have good coding systems for heat, right? If someone I think is exposed to heat, I can say it's heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. There isn't a code for heat-related illness. But a lot of the stuff we're talking about today is heat that's related to that illness, right? That heat exposure magnified another illness. So heat-related illness is a diagnosis. I put it on my charts. If I think someone has heat-related illness, they may not meet heat exhaustion, they may not meet heat stroke, but some of these other things, like in this heat waves mnemonic, right, could be exacerbated. So we think asthma or lung exacerbations, heart disease, right? I go out in the, we're going to talk about how I go out in the heat and I have heart disease, how that could be worse for me. So whether it's a traumatic injury, allergies, vector-borne diseases, emotional stress, the heat waves mnemonic is kind of a way. This is from the Florida. We talked about state chapters yesterday. This is from the Florida state chapter. So they use a heat wave mnemonics. In Florida, sees a different kind of heat, right? They're seeing heat and humidity, and they have a lot of outdoor workers, a lot of agriculture in Florida. So they have their own issues, but you're trying to think about heat in different ways. So let's look at our body, right? I'm not going full on physiology, but just to understand some very basics of what our body does with heat, right? A couple major defense mechanisms. First thing we can do is sweat. Second thing is we can vasodilate. Like that's it. And the third one is really our brain, right? Our brain is probably our best defense mechanism, but it's not a physiologic. But our brain's important because we think, oh, I go outside, I should go inside because it's so hot. Or, oh, I'm thirsty. And your brain's like, I think we should drink some water. And you're like, that's a great idea. If you lose that impairment, or if you're impaired, right, and you're not thinking I need to go inside and cool myself, or you're not thinking I need to drink more water, or you're modifying your behavior, whether that's because I'm a baby and I don't have those thoughts, or a demented person and I can't have those thoughts, maybe I'm intoxicated or on drugs and I don't have those rational thoughts, right? You're lowering that defense mechanism. So the brain's super important for us. But if our brain is functioning, our body's going to do a couple things, right? It's going to sweat or dilate. And when you sweat, what do? Right? You're putting fluid out on your skin so that it will evaporate. It takes heat away from our body. But when we do that, we lose fluids, right? 75% of our body's fluid. So now we start to get dehydrated. If we get dehydrated, we have less circulating blood flow, right? If I have less blood flow, I'm not putting as much blood flow to my kidneys, not putting as much blood flow to my gut, right? And so that can cause ischemic changes in those areas. That can release endotoxins, and eventually you'll lead to like multi-organ failure, right? So it's a toxic component. Even though sweating's helpful, if we're not replenishing that fluid loss, we can have damage from decreased blood perfusion to certain organs. Things like in pregnancy, and we're going to talk about this later, right? In pregnancy, the body sees in a heat, like we're going to not send blood to the uterus, right? What's going to be the complications of that? We'll talk about that later. The other thing is if I don't have as much blood volume going around, right? I'm going to have to increase my contractility in my heart to help move the same cardiac output I need. And if I'm peripheral vasodilating, right, I'm also dropping my blood flow and my blood pressure. So I'm going to have to increase my heart rate. And so this increased contractility and increased heart rate is leading to a strain on our hearts. So your hearts are getting strained, your kidneys are getting strained, your organs are getting strained by these defensive mechanisms. So temporary, it's okay, but long term can cause big problems. And we're not dogs, right? Dogs pant and kangaroos, they'll lick their forearms and lay down and like do different things. But we just sweat and peripherally vasodilate, and then we have to think to get out and think to drink. So heat's just not like, oh, I got heat cramps. It's not, one organ, right? It's not like the sun hits me, I get sunburned, I get blisters on my skin, maybe I have skin cancer later. No, it's almost every organ in our body, right? So we talked about the disease with the heart, we talked about the strain on the heart. We're going to talk about kidney function, we're going to talk about lung effects, musculoskeletal, you get breakdown, you get arthritis flares, right? And swelling that just comes on. Definitely we're going to cover the mental health component. So not just like, well, I'm going to feel faint or I don't feel good, but how it leads to long-term risks of dementia, maybe impulsiveness, aggressive behavior, things like that. Things that are not good for us as humans. So a lot of heat effects that we're seeing. Now we understand kind of some basic physiology, what's going on in our body. Let's talk about who's most affected. We've talked about climate health as a disease of the vulnerable, right? So what makes you vulnerable, right? How do you become vulnerable? Well, one is exposure, then how sensitive you are to that stressor, whatever that is. And today we're talking about heat. And then your resiliency or your adaptive capacity mitigates some of that exposure and sensitivity. And so this can be differentiated based on whatever it is going on with that person. Maybe the exposure component is, say, let's take a young, healthy outdoor worker, right? They're exposed because they're out in the heat all the time. So their exposure is really high. Sensitivity, they may not be as sensitive because they're doing it every day. That's their job. They've lived in that area. They're working outside. And because they're young and otherwise healthy, they have a really good adaptive capacity. But at certain points, that exposure could overwhelm that sensitivity and adaptive capacity. versus you take an elderly patient, maybe on medications, and maybe they have some early Parkinson's, maybe can't cool themselves where they live. So now their exposure could be mild, right? Just a warm day in the shade in their house, but they're very sensitive to it, right? They're on different medications that put them at risk. They don't have the same adaptive capacity. Maybe that's secondary to finances, maybe it's secondary to where they live or the lack of a functioning AC unit. And that minimal exposure could lead to vulnerability. So let's look at these groups and kind of think it through. We have to think through those three categories. But when we talk about who's our vulnerable populations, it's a lot, right? We're all kind of exposed when we go outside, right? You go outside and you walk through Tucson or you walk through Phoenix, you're going to be exposed to the same heat as someone down the street, right? We're all exposed. But pregnant patients, newborns, right? The very young, the very old, right? So extremes of age, people with chronic illnesses, right? Especially like heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, all of those mental health issues, dementia, opiate use disorder, right? People who are outdoor workers, whether it's construction, agriculture, people on solar doing on the roofs, right? I talked to some of our people when they installed solar last year, and I said, "So how do you guys like deal with the heat? Are you guys looking to shift and maybe work in the morning or like work at night and everything? Like, how do you mitigate this?" And he basically looked at me and said, everyone in the solar business has had heat stroke. It's just like it's a known thing. And I was like, oh damn. I was like, that's not good. And he's like, nope, we just try to mitigate it as best we can. So long exposures, right? That's going to be people that we're going to see. All our communities of color and our indigenous populations are at higher risk. Mentally ill, right? We're going to talk about schizophrenia, and that's a specific kind of, they have their own issues, but anyone with mental illness has a decreased ability to be resilient. Our homeless populations are unhoused, and then our poor, right? If I can't afford an AC unit, if I can't afford to fix my swamp cooler, if I can't afford transportation to go to a cooling center, or don't have those means, it's going to be worse for me. So it's a lot of population, right? A lot of us are healthy. We're young, we're healthy. Hopefully we're not well, maybe we're pregnant, I don't know, but like we're not dealing with these chronic illnesses, so we have a lot more resilience, but most of our patients don't. And that's who we're seeing on a regular basis. Let's talk about kids for a little bit, right? Kids are unique. They're smaller, and because when they're smaller and babies, right, that surface to volume ratio is different. So they lose volume and they sweat quicker and are more susceptible. They also can't regulate their temperature and hydration status. And also have a different exposure, right? A lot of kids in Arizona, the school is outdoors, right? I walk outdoors. I hopefully have a cool place at school. But what do kids like to do after school? Well, I want to go outside, right? I play sports, I do soccer, I do softball. I'm out playing things. I want to go outside. And they want to go outside at 3 o'clock after they get out of school. Well, that's pretty hot, right? So they're going to have this increased exposure component. And so you're seeing this in kids, they have kind of this neat, unique exposure. They also do something a little bit different, right? Kids are there. I mean, we're there to learn too, but their whole purpose is to learn. So if you take kids and heat, they're learning. Their whole goal is right to learn and be educated at that point. It impairs their learning process, right? And we see this math is more impaired than English. So the more exposures to heat that you have, the decreased learning. And heat's additive, right? So if I'm exposed to multiple days of heat in a row, that adds up. So maybe the first few days it's not so bad, but three, four, five, what if it's 20 days in a row of over 100-degree temperatures, right? That's an additive component that they're being exposed to. And especially with sleep, right? Who wants to sleep when it's hot? I'll tell you, when I was in Iraq, I was absolutely miserable sleeping. There was no AC units, and my choice was either to sleep on the ground, sweating my balls off, and getting bit by mosquitoes, or I would have to be in a layer of a sleeping bag to not be bit and be even hotter. And sleep sucked, right? So it's not, we like a cool winter sleep, absolutely great. So it's better, right? Sleep is affected. And as kids are learning, we know that sleep's super important, right? If you don't sleep well, your mental health goes down. You don't retain knowledge. The things you learned in the day are worse. And there's definitely a racial inequity with this. So communities of color, so Black populations, Hispanic populations, indigenous populations, they experience these learning losses 3 to 4 times as much. And this may be secondary to lack of green space that they have where they live, or the inability to cool where they live. So heat and learning is really affecting kids. So I want to bring that up too. And this additive component is just not just for kids, but it's for adults and anybody. Let's talk about humidity, right? We don't see the humid heat as much, but say Florida, right? We talk about dry heat in Arizona, but say Florida, the Southeast, they see a really humid heat. Well, how does humidity affect us, right? If it's humid outside, I can still peripherally dilate, I can still sweat, but the sweat is not evaporating at the same rate. I don't get that cooling capacity. And so, what is that doing? Well, it's straining the heart more and it's straining the kidneys more. So, we have to think about humidity. And when we think about humidity, it's not just temperature. So, when we take temperature and humidity, we come up with a term called a heat index. So, a heat index, when we look at it, and this is from from NOAA. So, if we take a temperature on the top on this grid and humidity on the side, we that humidity magnifies that temperature more than what it would feel like if it was dry. So let's take 100 degrees. At 40% humidity, it would feel like 109 degrees. But if the humidity went up to 65% at 100 degrees, it would feel like it's 136 degrees. So that's the relative temperature that you would be feeling or being exposed to. So a dry heat definitely is cooler than a hot heat. And yet, so you can see when a place like Houston has 90-degree temperatures and 70% humidity, it's feeling like 105, right? It's feeling a lot harder than that 90 degrees. So that's the heat index, humidity plus temperature combined. There's another component. I don't know if anyone's heard of a wet bulb globe thermometer or a wet bulb globe index. We used to use this. The military uses this to determine when you could go out and do training days. So if your wet bulb globe index is measured and it says, okay, it's too high, it's past a threshold, no one could do training outside until it came down. So they would put out things to help prevent heat-related illness for recruits, for active duty members. So a wet bulb globe index is this device here. It has a humidity component, it has a dry component, and it measures different things. So the heat index and the wet bulb globe index are better representatives of overall temperature than just the temperature itself because it takes into different factors. So if we look at like what the different factors are, the two different things, like the wet bulb globe thermometer, is what you would be exposed to when you were in the sun, whereas the heat index is measured in the shade. So a wet bulb, so go say I go sit outside in the sun, that wet bulb globe index is going to take what it feels like in the sun. It's going to take variables about shade, maybe from clouds, or maybe the angle of the sun. It's going to take those inputs as well. It's going to take wind in account. It will take temperature and humidity, just like the heat index, but it's going to use some of those different markers to kind of say, what does this feel like? What is that heat stress that the body's actually seeing, not just the temperature itself? Because that's kind of what we're looking at with this, right? A temperature is a temperature, but we want to know what is the true like value of heat stress that the body is seeing. So we have to take these other components involved. So maybe in terms of our knowledge and passing on from a weather component, we shouldn't just be talking temperature. Maybe we should be talking heat index. Maybe we should be talking wet bulb globe thermometer and getting those values out there and presenting that maybe to like our outdoor workers who are outside. And if they had that information, would that change their behavior? Would they modify things for that? So it's understanding different ways that we can communicate this knowledge and share with not just our patients, but our communities and say, maybe this is a better way that we could look at heat. Maybe this is a better way we could understand heat and what we need to do to prevent this. There's different parts of our country, right? we talked about heat in different ways. We get into the hundreds, 110s, even 120s on a regular basis. We have kind of an acclimatization, and it's a different, drier heat than what's being seen in other places. So this is heat index ranges for what peak hospitalization rates. So meaning in that area, if the heat index gets to this level, that's when we start to see more people come into the hospital. So you can see like on the West Coast, a heat index of 81 or, maybe enough, but we're getting them to 101. That's because we see it on a regular basis, but they may be sitting that delta, right? That change where it's been 60, 70, and they're feeling that bump, right? So if you're slowly adjusting over time as the temperatures slowly go up, usually not as bad, versus all of a sudden a day pops up and the temperature goes up really fast or not what you're used to, you will be more stressed by that heat than otherwise. So hospitalization rates go up with heat, right? That affects all of us, no matter what we're doing, whether that's we're like, well, I'm not doing that, right? I'm an ENT doc. It doesn't bother me. Well, if you can't get an OR time, it bothers you, right? So there's different ways because the hospital's filled, we got to cancel surgeries. So there's different ways that people may be affected in this from heat. Humidity, right? We talked about humidity and heat. In the last 20 years, this is looking at rates at which we have seen double the amount of hot, humid days in the last 20 years. So people are like, this heat isn't really new. It's absolutely new. We're doubling the amount of heat days that we're seeing almost every part of the country. And it's secondary to not just temperature, but humidity over the last 20 years. So we are increasing our heat. Let's talk about heat island, right? So, heat island effect, we've kind of mentioned before. But there is a difference, the same temperature if you go in a city and then you just go outside the rural area, same location, different temperatures. Why is that? It's because of the heat island effect, right? So the problem is in cities or where we have urbanized, we put buildings, hardscape, pavement. All of those, when the sunlight hits it, has different components, right? So the sunlight hits a black asphalt, the road, that absorbs, right? That solid surface absorbs heat really well. It then radiates that heat back out. So it's not just absorbing it and letting it go, it's absorbing it and then radiating the heat back. So now you're getting a radiated heat plus direct sunlight heat. The same thing happens in buildings. A lot of our buildings are made of solid structure, whether it's cement or concrete or some kind of, hardened product, and they also have windows. And so when that solar energy comes, it reflects off the windows. It actually can be magnified. So that reflective capacity, when it hits the ground, is hitting at a higher temperature than if it would just hit directly. Or maybe it's reflecting to an area that was shaded but now is getting more sunlight. So the heat, that energy is being transmitted. What do we also have in our, we talked about a little bit about this yesterday. We have air conditioner units, right, on the top of buildings. A lot of those to cool the building. Well, what do the air conditioning units do, right? They're sending cold air into the building and they're sending hot air out into the environment. So you get this magnification of different things and cars in and of itself, right? In an internal combustion engine car, a byproduct of making the car go is to produce heat, right? You put your hand on the hood and it's hot. So that heat is being radiated. And there's more cars in a city, in an urban setting, than there are in a rural setting. So these are some of the extra heat components and how it gets re-radiated. Now, in the rural setting, or ways to mitigate this, right, are trees. We talked about trees. They release water vapor, right, as part of their respiration. That evaporates and creates a cooling process. So any green space cools and mitigates a heat island effect. In places that have rivers or water bodies through the city, there's some evaporation, and through that evaporation, also heat is taken away from the environment. So that leads to a cooling effect. So heat island effects are seen where there's hardscape, large buildings, and lots of roadways. Before we get on to talking about any physiologic stuff, any questions so far on heat? Is there anything in the chat? I can't see that. No? Cool. All right. Let's go on. So let's just talk disease specific, right? Does this affect the cardiovascular system? Absolutely. So this is right, this is mortality difference. So for every 1 degree Celsius above the heat wave threshold, so we kind of mentioned heat wave threshold based on the area you live, 2.1% mortality, cardiovascular disease. Mortality, this is absolute risk. So the hotter it gets, more heart disease, more heart failure, more heart death, right? There's a lot of cardiovascular drugs, to put this in perspective, that don't do any absolute mortality benefit. Most of the drugs we give for heart disease have no mortality benefit, right? They have to be combined with different things over time. It's a combo endpoint in trials. Maybe it's decreased heart attack and heart failure and hospitalization, but they're not showing straight mortality difference. But heat by itself, for anyone with heart disease, is a straight mortality difference, right? Magnified by humidity, magnified by pollution levels, and magnified by lack of green space. And this is it, right? This is stuff coming from cardiology literature, but we don't talk about this. We don't talk about like, oh, you have high cholesterol and diabetes and high blood pressure. You're at risk for heart disease, right? We talk about those as risk factors, but what about you're a 55-year-old outdoor worker? Is that a risk factor? Probably, but we don't talk about it, right? Maybe this is something we need to ask or like help patients with modification. Or after they've had a heart attack, should they be going back out into the heat? Or maybe we should offer them like alternatives, like this is going to affect your livelihood. Maybe you look for something else. Respiratory illness. So look at the lungs, right? Heat we talked about can cause drought and wildfires. It can magnify in those components, but it's causing a mortality difference in COPD. Same thing, 4% for COPD patients. It also causes asthma exacerbation, respiratory illness, whether it's pneumonia or viral illnesses, bronchiolitis. So it flares up the lungs, partly from the heat injury itself and an inflammatory component, but also the compounding, right? When you dry places out, when you have particulates, we're going to get into that component and how that affects your lungs. But mortality difference for COPD patients. Let's talk about kidneys, right? Kidney disease, we think, okay, well, yeah, if you have end stage like heat stroke, your kidneys are going to fail. But we talked about like just decreasing blood flow and not enough volume, you're going to have acute kidney injury. You're not going to have enough flow to your kidneys. A little dehydration, right, can lead to kidney injury. But there's also chronic kidney disease. There's a chronic kidney disease called Mesoamerican nephropathy, and it was seen in kind of Central America workers. It's also seen in like India and Sri Lanka, but they were noticing that these healthy young men doing physical work in the outdoor setting, especially like sugar canes, rice fields, agricultural settings, were getting chronic kidney disease. And they think it's kind of an exposure from heat in a chronic stress and dehydrated state. But it wasn't they were diabetics. It wasn't they were hypertensive. It wasn't that they were having anything else other than the heat component and leading to chronic kidney disease with that. So, do some of our workers here in Tucson have that? Possibly. I haven't even thought about that, right? Doing this talk, thinking about, like it makes me look at chronic kidney disease a different way. Maybe I should be, this is something that we should be thinking about early on. And obviously, like kidney stones can, right? If you're getting dehydrated, you could have kidney stones. But you're increasing, like higher temperatures are leading to more hospitalizations, visits, and sick days for patients with kidney disease. What about the hormonal axis, right? Like we talked about it affecting our brain, but what about like those stressors for hormones, right? Heat is a stress response, right? So it's like it fires our sympathetic nervous system because it is a stress to our body. But it may also like decrease some of our thyroid function because we don't want to create more, right? We don't want to have thyroid going and then create more heat when we're already heat. So it may shut that down. It's going to affect like our ADP and aldosterone systems because we're going to try like, hey, we need to keep some water in our body. So we're going to change that hormonal component with the kidneys. But some other things, right? Diabetics, like it's a special population for heat. There's a couple different things, right? Diabetics overall try to keep their sugars under control, but a lot of times their sugars creep up. And as your sugars creep up, what happens? You pee more. So if you're peeing more from higher sugars, you're going to be in this kind of pre-dehydrated state or constant dehydrated state. So now you're already losing some of your adaptive capacity just from your baseline state with where you live. We've also seen in diabetics, right, they don't have as good peripheral blood flow, right? They get, diabetic foot ulcers and other diabetic complications with that. So they lose their vasodilation capacity. So two of their major defense mechanisms, right? I'm in a pre-dehydrated, I'm losing fluid, I can't sweat as much, and I'm in a inability to peripherally dilate. So two different effects. And if their sugars are high, right, that's making them pee more, which their body doesn't want to do. So it's this like combination is not good for them. There's also studies that have looked at like type 2 diabetics, and they overall sweat less when they exercise than normal patients. So if I'm a type 2 diabetic and I'm not sweating as much and I'm going out in the heat and that's just kind of my baseline, right? That's going to strain my heart even more. And diabetics already have heart disease. So if you're straining their heart and they have heart disease, it's just even a more compounding thing. So diabetics are kind of a really special population that we should be worried about, especially for our for heat exposure to them. We talked about diabetes just as straight, but gestational diabetes and pregnancy complications can occur as well, right? So, because we see that heat is changing like glucose metabolism, you actually get increased insulin resistant in pregnancy, and that's leading to gestational diabetes. But also, as it gets hotter, more preterm births, more stillbirths, there's more neural tube defects. So looking at patients exposed to high heat for a long period of time when pregnant have a higher rate of neural tube defects, atrial septal defects, especially when it's in the early stages of embryo development. So pregnant patients, remember we talked about, and why is this, right? I'm not sending blood flow to the placenta, right? I'm shifting it to other parts of my body. It can lead to increased miscarriage rates and preterm birth weights as well. So for pregnant patients, heat is definitely, and you can see we are in an area where more pregnant patients are being exposed to heat on a regular basis. So it puts them at higher risk as well. What about neurologically, right? So we talked about the strain on our cardiovascular system. What about our neurologic system, right? Increased risk of stroke, increased risk of seizures. So, we don't typically think of like seizures and heat as a stressor, right? Did you sleep? Were you playing video games last night? Did you stop your medications? But like seizure patients. So we talked about stories. I had a patient this past summer came in and he had had three seizures and came in. He's like, and he was back to normal. I was like, hey, how's it going? He's like, yeah, he had three seizures today. His wife was worried. And I kind of asked him, I said, well, what was going on? I'm taking my meds, everything. And I said, sleeping okay? Yeah. I couldn't get anything out of him. Infections, nothing. I said, exposed to, like, what'd you do today? Oh, I was moving. You were moving. Oh, what were you moving? Well, we're moving to a different house. I said, okay. So you were outside? Oh, yeah, we were outside all day. I was like, okay, here we go. Right? So he was just doing a simple move, but in the heat of the summer, all day exposure, and then got an ER bill and had to come in because he had seizures for that. So again, maybe mentioning to our seizure patients, high temperatures may lower your threshold, just modify your behaviors. I don't know if anyone's heard of Uthoff's phenomenon. Like I had not. So in looking this up, this is for multiple sclerosis patients. So another neurologic patient, right? They can have these weird like flares with even half a degree Celsius in temperature. And it could be from like a hair dryer or a hot bath or I got in the jacuzzi, but it'll give them like muscle weakness, cognitive dysfunction, balance problems, fatigue from minimal. So they're kind of like a little bit, higher risk as is, right? And then long-term heat exposure increases your risk of dementia. So I don't think any of us want dementia. So modify maybe our behaviors, but it'd be interesting to see, do our patients, maybe our outdoor workers, maybe those that are exposed for prolonged periods of time, are they getting a higher dementia rate? And that's where we're seeing some of this in this area. So a lot of neurologic complications secondary to heat. Yesterday, I think Marissa had mentioned GI components, right? Her dog had pancreatitis, right? We talk about scorpions with pancreatitis and gallbladder disease and all these things. I don't remember learning about heat as a cause of pancreatitis, but it's a cause, right? Pancreatitis can be flared up by heat in and of itself. And you also can get GI infections, you can get biliary tract disease, liver disease. Um, Patients a lot of time, right? How do I beat the heat? I'm going to go have a cold beer, and then I get two, and then I have a six pack, and then I'm on the floor, right? So chronic alcohol use as an adaptive component could lead to cirrhosis in these patients as well. And because, we go to picnics in the heat in the summer and grandma's potato salad sits out in the heat, guess what? We get a little more GI infections, right? So there's different components that our GI tract is being affected. But a lot of GI conditions are being increased, whether it's esophagitis or cirrhosis or biliary tract disease, inflammatory bowel flares. So whether it's inflammatory bowel or irritable bowel, both of those can be increased from and can have exacerbations secondary to heat. So let's talk a little bit about like mental health and mental illness, both on just a stress component, but then also on a overall like mental health disorders and psychologic disorders. So, right, climate change we know is leading to this extreme heat. That extreme heat's hitting us in different ways, right? Our physical health, the amount of time we go outside, right? I'm not going to go outside if it's hot all the time. I'm going to have to stay inside. We talked about just the overall, like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired of its heat. You get stressed with that heat, right? None of us function as well when we're in high heat situations. The same as extreme cold, right? Our cognitive function goes down at each extreme of those temperatures, right? And we don't sleep as well. And lack of sleep, as I mentioned before, is a big component of your mental health. If any of you, when you go through this residency and you're not getting as much sleep, you'd be like, I don't feel good. I'm depressed and anxious. Absolutely, that's going to happen. The number one thing to help with that will be sleep. I even, I have that same thing. When I'm working a string of shifts and not sleeping as well, my mental health goes down. But all of this stresses us and just leads to more irritability, agitation, not the right decision making, right? And we have adaptive behaviors that are not appropriate. So maybe we snap at people, irritability, things like that. Those are baseline human mental health changes, all from heat. But if we take now mental health disease and kind of those outcomes, we see increase in depression rates, we see increased mental health hospitalizations overall. So more people come to the ER, more people get hospitalized in extreme heat, especially with mental illness. There's a lot more aggression we talked about, and whether that's self-aggression in terms of a suicide component or homicidal or violent crimes or agitation, those are also associated and increased with extreme heat. Let's talk about some specific populations. So schizophrenics are really an interesting population with this, and we're seeing in studies that they are super sensitive to extreme heats, and a couple reasons, right? One, a lot of schizophrenics, maybe they have paranoia or delusional disorders that are component. So when they have flares, cognitively, they're not making the right decision. Like they think the world is against them. I'm not going to come in for help. I'm paranoid you're going to hurt me. And so they stay outside or do something that's maladaptive, right? They're not going to a cooling center. They're not making the wise choice to go to the shade. So that component is bothering them. Schizophrenics also are on medications, and we're going to talk about that, that may decrease their ability to sweat or regulate their temperature. So that's another component. There's also studies that look in schizophrenics compared to non-schizophrenics. With exercise, schizophrenic and non-schizophrenics heart rates will go up, but during a rest period, normal people will drop their heart rate. Schizophrenics don't. So after an exercise or an extreme stress, they don't have the adaptive drop in the heart rate. So they have kind of a consistent heart rate. So a prolonged cardiovascular strain that we see in schizophrenics, as we talked about, heart being affected by extreme heat, they're getting even a second component on that heart. So there's lots of issues with schizophrenia, and they have a disproportionate number. The largest proportion of heat-related deaths are schizophrenic patients compared to the normal population. So, talked about suicide going up, hospitalizations. But let's talk about some of these medications that some of our mental health patients will be on, and just talk about meds that maybe anyone's on a daily basis, right? So I'm part of there's a heat drug task force with the University of Arizona. So I'm working with public health officials, the chief heat index or chief heat officer for the state of Arizona, Eugene LeVar. We have people from the Poison Control Center, from Arizona Department of Health and Human Services. We have people from the coroner's office. So a lot of us are looking at pharmacists as well. And so we're looking at like how do we get information out about the interactions between medications and health. And so this is a list of a bunch of medications, but in brief, like how do we do that level alertness? And so that's a question we're trying to work on. But overall, if you look at these meds, so thinking about things like diuretics or cardiovascular meds, maybe it's high blood pressure. How do those in fact, impact and make you more prone to a heat-related illness? Well, diuretics is easy, right? I pee more, so I'm in a dehydrated state. But a lot of like antihistamines, like over-the-counter Benadryl, anticholinergic meds, right? So anticholinergic meds, you don't sweat as much. And if you don't sweat as much, you're not going to dissipate that heat, right? Antipsychotic meds, ADHD meds, maybe some of our Parkinson's meds, levodopa. So cardiovascular, mental health meds are two kind of big categories, and then any anticholinergic med you want to think about. But how many of our patients are going to be on this, right? A lot of you are going to be in internal medicine. I think a lot of your patients will be on diuretics, in ARBs, and beta blockers and things like that. So it's something to think about. Maybe, hey, you're on this medication, you're going to be less resilient. So how can we modify those behaviors? Besides medications, other things are drugs, right? Just straight drug. So you have two different kind of drugs that you're seeing. One is a stimulant, so a sympathomimetic, right? Whether it's meth or ecstasy or cocaine, right? It revs you up, it increases your heart rate, which is already strained. You don't want to eat or drink as much, so you're decreasing that replenishment of volume and it's increasing your body temperature, right? So that puts you at more prone. Whereas on the opposite side, right, an opiate use disorder, alcohol, some of the depressant components. If I depress my brain, I'm not doing good adaptive behaviors. So I'm laying on the street in the heat. I'm not going inside. I'm passing out where I used that medication or had an overdose. So we see in a lot of our heat-related death is associated with substance abuse. So whether it's opiate use disorder, alcohol use disorder, or other drugs, there's a disproportionate, just like with schizophrenia, of medications plus drug use. So these complications are leading to a lot of our heat deaths. What about infectious disease? How is extreme heat changing this? Well, the higher temperatures are changing the insects, kind of like when we talk about insects, we're really talking about infectious diseases like ticks and mosquitoes, and it's increasing their ability to reproduce for a longer season, right? Because when I go to Minnesota and it's cold, there are no mosquitoes, right? They shut down in the winter and then they come back out when it warms up. But if we have a longer, warmer summer, there's more replication time, right? There's a longer time that they're going to be active. And as long as they're active, they can spread disease. The other component is places that used to not have these ticks or used to not have mosquitoes are getting them again because these animals are expanding their ranges because things are getting warmer. New habitats are becoming available to them. So with that, we're like, okay, that's not good. And then the thing that humans like to do is like, I like to go to the forest. And guess where the ticks live? They live in the forest, and the mosquitoes, and they love to be in the forest. So we love to be there, but we just have to manage ourselves. And how do we, give recommendations? Okay, make sure you do a tick check. Make sure you go do, care for yourself in the outpatient setting. I'll be honest, like we were in um, Germany last year and we went out on some hikes and then came back and I had my son, I was like, I think there's a tick on you. Well, he took off all his clothes and looked and he had 7 ticks on him. It was ridiculous. Like I have like, dude, you're like a collector. Like this is crazy. So they were like in his sweatshirt and he had like sweatshirt and pants on, so they were hidden everywhere. So doing a simple tick check if you're going out in the woods, something that we could easily convey to our patients. Any questions on that and the impacts there before we do solutions? Cool. See, now I'm gonna continue. So simple solutions, like how do you talk to patients about this? How do you talk to community members? Simple things, right? Like loose, light, clothing, right? You look at a lot of people, in the Middle East, long linens, light in color, breezy, allows for circulation, allows for sweating, wide brim hats, sunscreen, drink water. Don't drink a bunch of alcohol, in the middle of the day and pass out. And then modify your behavior. If it's super hot, don't go outside. Don't go on a hike in Tucson in 120 degrees, right? Because then we got to call out someone and come pick you up when you pass out. So simple modification behaviors, these are things that we can increase that adaptive capacity, increase that resilience for our patients. And then education, right? We're talking about it here, but having the simple communication techniques, right? How do we get into schools? How do we get into dental schools, medical school? How do we get into early education we talked about, right? How do we get kids and high schoolers and undergrads? How do they hear the simple message, right? We have fossil fuels induced climate change, it giving us more heat waves. Here's some compounding vulnerable populations. Besides heat stroke and dehydration, may affect your heart, may affect your lungs, may affect your mind, strokes, dementia, things like that, may affect your kidneys. Simple messaging from us, right? We're trusted providers, trusted people, simple messaging, getting it out to communities at all levels, all education levels. And then we can talk about resilience, right? So when you look at different resilience, this goes back to the policy stuff we talked about yesterday. So, one of the things we talked about cooling centers, right? Cooling centers are present in Arizona. Why do we have cooling centers? Because we want people that can't cool themselves at home to have a place to go and cool down. So whether that's a library, whether that's just riding the bus all day is a mobile cooling center, and subways in cities are a lot of mobile cooling centers that people can ride all day. Whether it's going to the mall and just telling patients, you know what, instead of doing your walk in your neighborhood, why don't you go walk in the mall? It's AC, you can walk for a long time, you're going to be fine, right? So trying to get people to cooling centers. So that's kind of a policy component. There's other policies that we have that are giving rebates for patients. So different patient rebates where, hey, if you change your AC unit to a more energy efficient AC unit, we'll give you $8,000, right? There's different programs. Or maybe we work with Tucson Electric Power and where you cannot turn off someone's electricity in the summertime when it's extremely hot. So even if they miss a payment, they won't lose their electricity. Or maybe you need to repair your swamp cooler or AC system. We're going to give you a rebate for that if you meet these certain thresholds. So allowing for patients that can't necessarily afford it, so those less resilient, trying to give them a buffer in terms of policy to resiliency. And then in terms of cities and urban planning, we talked about like green infrastructure. So whether that's more shade trees, putting green roofs on buildings, green sides of buildings, decreasing the reflectivity. You can probably see a lot of buildings in Arizona that have over their windows shade structures. So the heat is not coming into the building, but it's also decreasing that reflectivity off the glass. So a lot of these things, maybe decreasing our roadways amounts, right? We may have less air, more green space and less hardscape. Those are different ways that we can increase resiliency to beat the heat, right? And try to cool our cities is doing simple stuff like this. And then we get to the root of the problem, right? We're going to keep hearing this, right? Decreasing fossil fuel consumption. How do you do that? Well, we could have a faster uptake of electric vehicles. We talk about internal combustion vehicles in cities, right? Emitting heat when they're running, right? Other things we can talk about is how about aviation and maritime, right? You have planes going off. Could we get more sustainable aviation fuels? So you'll hear something in the near future, right, you're going to hear SAFs, sustainable aviation fuels. So it's a biofuel, not a petroleum or oil-based fuel, but can companies start to use those, which would have a decreased emission profile, less warming potential with that. The same thing with large cargo ships and container ships that are circulating around the world on a regular basis. Huge polluters are the ways to make those more efficient Is it ways to change those fuels so it's less polluting, therefore less greenhouse gases, less impact? Other things, how do we accelerate renewables? How do we decrease use of plastics? How do we increase recycling of plastics? Are there ways that we can change heating sources and cooking sources, right? So you're like, I'm cooking with gas. Well, yeah, you're cooking with gas, but that's natural gas and it's worse than the environment. Can we switch you over to an induction stovetop? You're using residential heat, not necessarily here in Arizona, but like East Coast, they have residential heat that could be oil based. So they're still burning like heating oil back there. And could we switch that over to an electric, maybe powered by a renewable? And then are there ways to increase efficiencies in iron and steel making, right? So there's companies looking to basically get to high temperatures with an electrical component and then just use the natural gas or coal for that last. So it decrease the overall fossil fuels in those industries. So lots of different ways that we can start to decrease the fossil fuels, and that will lead to decrease in heat. So in summary today, we talked about extreme heat and what we're seeing in Arizona. It's obviously an issue here, but it's becoming an issue nationwide. It's hitting patients in Europe. It's hitting places in England, places that didn't have AC units. Portland, no one has an AC unit, but now they're getting AC units because it's getting hot on a regular basis. So we've kind of identified that problem and how it's really affecting all of us. We talked about how our body's defensive mechanisms, whether it's mentally going inside or drinking more water or making good behaviors or decisions, is important, but also our ability to sweat or vasodilate as defense mechanisms are super important. And we talked about how that heat is affecting our communities and how we're trying to measure that, right? Whether it's a heat index or a wet bulb, um, globe thermometer, and using those and taking humidity and what it's like with wind and sun and everything, and saying, maybe this is something that we should be talking about because it really gives us a better number of what heat we're being exposed to. We went through kind of an organ based and talked about the cardiovascular risk, the lung risk, the mental illness risks. We talked about how our kidneys are affected. So we went kind of systematically through thinking of things beyond just the normal, right? We thought about pancreatitis and pregnancy issues from heat, not just heat exhaustion and heat cramps. And then we talked about meds. We went through kind of the anticholinergics, the heart meds, the high blood pressure meds, the diuretics, the mental health meds, and how all of those mixed with drug use, so whether it's opiate use disorder, alcohol use disorder, or stimulant use, leads to increased heat deaths and puts our patients at risk. But then we also talked about solutions. So this is a picture from the U of A Environmental Science building. I don't know if any of you have gone through that, but it's a really cool example of green infrastructure, right? A lot of shading of the windows, open space, using green parts, right, in terms of plants and reflective components to decrease the temperature, that urban heat island effect, and keep things cool. We talked about decreasing fossil fuel usage and just simple strategies that we can help educate our patients with. And that's the goal, right? We are just trying to educate our patients and get them in a more resilient state so that they can combat extreme heat. Any questions? And this is actually that is in northern Arizona. So we do actually have windmills in northern Arizona. So in case anyone was wondering about that, there